They told his kids to be ashamed of him. They had no idea what this man survived to still show up every single night. One video. One cruel joke. It was about to reach more people than anyone in that hallway could imagine. She had stayed silent for 3 years to protect him. Tonight, silence finally ran out. No script, no rehearsal. Just the truth, and a 16-year-old girl brave enough to finally say it out loud. By morning, the whole world would know the name they once whispered with shame, Tal, and why they were wrong to ever whisper it.
Before this story begins, if you believe in second chances, in children who refuse to let the world break their family, and in the quiet kind of courage that changes everything, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one deserve to be seen by as many people as possible. Stay until the very end, because what these two kids did will stay with you long after this video ends. It started with a phone held up in a school hallway, laughing voices behind it, and a single sentence that would nearly destroy a family that had already survived so much. "Your dad's the guy who mops our bathrooms," a boy named Tyler Grant sneered at Jason Bennett, 13 years old, holding his lunch tray in front of the entire 8th grade hallway. "My mom says he used to be somebody. Now he's a janitor. Must be nice being nobody's son." The hallway erupted in laughter. Someone filmed it. By the time the final bell rang, the video had already been shared in 3 different group chats, captioned with a single crying laughing emoji and the words, "Bennett Family L." Jason didn't cry in that hallway. He had learned over the past 3 years exactly how to keep his face still while something inside him quietly cracked. He walked home with his backpack straps pulled too tight against his shoulders, past the same brick houses he'd walked past his whole life, past the park where his father used to push him on the swings before everything changed. And he did not say a single word to his sister Emma, 16, who was waiting for him at the corner like she did every single day since their mother passed. The park bench near their old house still had David's initials carved into it from a summer years ago, back when Saturdays meant pancakes and bike rides instead of overtime shifts and quiet worry. Jason still walked past that bench sometimes on purpose, just to remember that version of his father existed before all of this, a version most of his classmates would never believe if he tried to describe it to them. Emma noticed anyway. She always did. She had inherited that particular gift from her mother, the ability to read a person's silence like a language all its own. "What happened?" she asked, not as a question but as a statement, the kind that expects an answer because it already suspects the truth. Jason didn't answer until they reached their front porch, until he saw, through the living room window, their father kneeling by the coffee table, carefully gluing the broken leg of a chair he'd found on the curb because they couldn't afford a new one. That image, his father, 42 years old, once one of the most respected structural engineers in the state, hunched over a broken piece of secondhand furniture with a tube of wood glue and a look of quiet concentration, broke something loose in Jason that he could no longer hold back. He told Emma everything. The hallway, the laughter, the video, the word, nobody. Emma didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply looked through the window at their father, David Bennett, a tall man with tired hazel eyes and hands that had once signed off on blueprints for bridges and hospitals, now calloused from mop handles and floor buffers at Lincoln Heights Middle School, the very school his own children attended. 3 years ago, David Bennett had been a name printed on the side of buildings. Now he was a name people whispered about with pity, or worse, with cruelty, and his children had spent 3 years absorbing that cruelty in silence so their father would never have to know how much it cost them. This was not the first time Emma and Jason had been made to feel small for something they never chose. In the 3 years since the scandal broke, they had learned to sit quietly through the small cruelties that never quite rose to the level of something a teacher would notice or intervene in. A group project where nobody wanted the Bennett kid as a partner, a birthday party invitation list that mysteriously stopped including Emma the same month her father's name appeared in the local paper, a substitute teacher who once read the class roster aloud and paused just a beat too long on the name Bennett as if deciding whether to say something. Jason had stopped raising his hand in class around the same time other kids stopped inviting him over after school. Emma had quietly quit the debate team her sophomore year, not because she'd lost interest, but because she'd overheard 2 teammates joking that the Bennett family probably knew a thing or two about arguing their way out of trouble. Neither of them had ever told their father any of it. They had made a silent, unspoken pact somewhere in that first terrible year, that whatever it cost them personally, David Bennett had already lost enough, and they were not going to be one more thing weighing on his shoulders. To understand how a respected engineer ended up mopping the hallways his own kids walked through every day, you have to go back 5 years, to a gleaming office on the 14th floor of Meridian Structural Group, a firm David had helped build from nothing alongside a man he had once called his best friend, Richard Hale. David and Richard had met in college, two ambitious engineering students who used to stay up until 3 in the morning sketching skyscrapers on napkins, promising each other that one day their names would be on something that mattered. They built that company together, brick by brick, contract by contract, David handling the technical brilliance and public integrity of the firm, while Richard handled the deals, the handshakes, the smiling photographs at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. For 11 years, it worked. David trusted Richard with everything, the financials, the client contracts, even power of attorney over certain accounts during a period when David's late wife, Claire, was fighting the illness that would eventually take her. He was too busy holding his family together to notice that trust was being quietly weaponized against him. The collapse came fast and clean, like something engineered to look like an accident. A municipal bridge contract worth $11 million turned out to have falsified safety inspection reports attached to it. Reports bearing David's digital signature, his employee credentials, his name on every falsified document. When investigators came asking questions, Richard Hale sat across from David in that same 14th floor office, and with tears that David would only recognize as fake years later, said the words that ended everything. "I don't know how this happened, David. I trust you, but the paperwork, it's all under your login." David went from partner to prime suspect in the span of one afternoon. The real fraud, the skimmed funds, the falsified inspections that Richard had authorized to save costs and pocket the difference, had been buried under David's credentials Richard had access to the entire time as co-signer on the firm's digital infrastructure. The investigation dragged on for 18 months. David was never criminally convicted. There wasn't quite enough evidence to put him in prison, but there was more than enough smoke to end his career. His engineering license was suspended pending review. Meridian Structural Group quietly restructured, which meant David was pushed out with a severance check and a non-disparagement agreement, while Richard Hale remained standing, expressing to every reporter who called how devastated and betrayed he felt by his former partner's actions. No firm in the state would touch David Bennett's resume after that. Claire passed away 8 months into the investigation, worn down by chemotherapy, and by watching her husband's name dragged through headlines he didn't deserve. David buried his wife and his career in the same terrible year, and what remained was a man raising 2 children, alone, a suspended license he couldn't afford to fight for in court, and a mortgage he eventually lost. The janitor position at Lincoln Heights Middle School wasn't a fall from grace David chose. It was the only job that would hire a man whose name, when searched online, returned headlines about fraud allegations before anything else. He took it because it paid enough to keep a roof over Emma and Jason's heads, and because the night shift meant he could still walk them to school most mornings before clocking in. He never once complained in front of them. He never once let them see him ashamed. What he didn't know, what he had successfully hidden from them for 3 years, was exactly how much his children were paying for a crime their father never committed, in a currency made of whispered insults and viral videos and lunchroom tables where nobody wanted to sit near the Bennett kids. That night, after Jason finally told her everything, Emma sat on the edge of her bed long after the house went quiet, scrolling through the video that had already collected 400 views, then 800, then over 1,000 by midnight. She read comment after comment, some cruel, some indifferent, a few defending Jason but none defending her father, because nobody in that comment section actually knew who David Bennett really was. They only knew the headlines. They only knew the janitor. Something in Emma shifted that night, quietly, permanently, the way steel shifts under enough pressure before it either breaks or becomes something stronger. She had spent 3 years staying quiet to protect her father's dignity. She realized, staring at her ceiling at 2 in the morning, That silence had not protected anything. It had only given the story to people who never deserved to tell it. The next morning, Emma did something she had never done before. She set up her phone on a small tripod she'd bought years ago for a school project, sat on the front porch steps in the early gray light before her father woke for his shift, and she pressed record. She didn't write a script. She didn't rehearse. She simply looked into the camera and told the truth, all of it, in a voice that started shaking and then steadied into something that sounded almost exactly like her mother's. She talked about a father who used to design bridges people drove across every single day without ever knowing his name, and who now cleaned the same hallways his children walked through and did both jobs, the one he lost and the one he took, with the same quiet dignity. Because dignity, she said, was never about the title on your paycheck. She talked about a boy who filmed her little brother without asking, without knowing anything real about their family, and about a company that let an innocent man take the fall for another man's greed because it was easier than admitting the truth. She ended the video looking directly into the lens and said, "You can laugh at what my dad does for a living, but you will never know what it takes to lose everything and still show up every single day for your kids without ever once making them feel like a burden. That's not nobody. That's the strongest man I have ever known." Emma posted the video before she left for school, expecting maybe her 300 followers to see it, expecting maybe a handful of kind comments to soften whatever Jason was still feeling. She had no idea that a local news producer named Marisol Vega, scrolling through her phone during her morning coffee, would stop scrolling the moment Emma's voice broke on the words, "Still show up." She had no idea that by lunchtime the video would have 30,000 views, and by the time school let out, it would have crossed 200,000, shared by strangers in states Emma had never even visited, captioned with words like, "This is what real strength looks like, and somebody give this family their story back." David found out the way most parents find out their child has gone viral, from someone else entirely. A co-worker at the school, a fellow custodian named Otis, who had worked beside David for 2 years without ever asking about his past, stopped him in the supply closet with his phone already unlocked. "David," Otis said carefully, "I think you need to see this." David watched his daughter's video standing among mop buckets and industrial cleaner, and for the first time in 3 years, in front of another adult, he did not manage to keep his face still. He cried the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much older than the video itself, somewhere that had been waiting 3 years for permission. The video's reach did something Emma hadn't fully anticipated. It reopened a case that most people, including some investigators, had quietly closed as unresolved. Marisol Vega, sensing a story far bigger than a viral clip, reached out to Emma directly through a message that Emma almost didn't open, assuming it was another troll. Marisol asked one simple question: would the family be willing to talk, on record, about what actually happened 5 years ago at Meridian Structural Group? Emma, without asking her father first, said yes, because she had spent 3 years watching him carry a silence that was never his to carry, and she was done letting other people write her family's story for them. What Marisol uncovered over the following 2 weeks turned out to be more than anyone expected. Digging through old public filings, she found a pattern that investigators 5 years earlier had either missed or chosen not to pursue too aggressively. A series of shell subcontracts routed through accounts that traced back not to David Bennett's login credentials at all, but to a secondary administrative account that only one person besides David had access to during that exact 18-month window, Richard Hale. More damning still, Marisol tracked down a former Meridian junior accountant, a woman named Priya Nair, who had quietly resigned 2 years after the scandal and had been sitting on a folder of internal financial records she'd never known what to do with, too afraid to come forward alone. Priya had noticed discrepancies back then but had been too junior, too scared of losing her own job, to speak up against a partner as powerful as Richard Hale. When Marisol called her and mentioned the name David Bennett, Priya didn't hesitate. "I always knew it wasn't him," she said. "I just didn't know how to prove it without ending my own career." Priya explained that in the months after David's departure, she had quietly photocopied and saved a handful of internal transfer logs that never quite matched the story Richard told investigators, tucking them away in a shoebox in her closet like evidence she never had the courage to use. She had watched, from a distance, as David's name was dragged through headline after headline while Richard Hale gave calm, composed interviews about learning to rebuild trust after tragedy. She had almost thrown the shoebox away twice, telling herself it wasn't her responsibility to fix what powerful men had broken. She was relieved, more than anything else, that a 16-year-old girl's video had finally given her a reason brave enough to outweigh her fear. Richard Hale, now the sole owner of a rebranded and thriving firm called Hale Dynamics, did not react well when Marisol's first article dropped online, titled, "The Janitor Who Used to Build Bridges, Reopening the Meridian Fraud Case." He called Marisol's editor demanding a retraction. He called his lawyers, and, in a decision that would ultimately be his undoing, he called David directly, late one night, in a voice that had lost all of its old warmth. "You need to control your daughter," Richard said, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like panic. "This isn't going to go the way you think it is. People forget. People move on. Don't make me remind everyone of things that were never fully resolved in the first place." It was, without Richard realizing it, the closest thing to a confession he had ever given, and David, hands trembling, recorded every second of it on the second phone Emma had insisted he start carrying just in case. For the first time in 5 years, David Bennett felt something other than grief and quiet endurance. He felt the specific, clean anger of a man who finally understood he had never needed to be ashamed at all. He didn't want revenge in the way Richard clearly feared. He didn't want to destroy a man's life the way his own had been destroyed. He wanted simply the truth, spoken loudly enough that his children would never again have to defend him in a school hallway. He handed the recording, along with everything else the family had gathered, directly to Marisol and to a state investigator who had reopened the file the moment Priya Nair's documents landed on his desk. The next 3 weeks moved faster than the previous 3 years combined. Priya's records, cross-referenced with the newly traced Shell accounts, painted an unmistakable picture. Richard Hale had authorized the falsified inspection reports himself, routed the skimmed contract funds through accounts disguised under vendor names, and deliberately structured the digital paper trail to implicate David's credentials, knowing David was too consumed with Claire's illness at the time to closely monitor account activity. A formal fraud indictment was filed against Richard Hale on a Tuesday morning in early spring, almost exactly 5 years to the day since David had first been called into that 14th floor office. By that Tuesday afternoon, Emma's original video had been viewed over 11 million times, and news vans that had never once parked outside Lincoln Heights Middle School were suddenly lined up along the curb. In the days between the indictment and the assembly, something shifted in the small, ordinary corners of the Bennett family's life that no news camera ever captured. Neighbors who had spent 3 years offering polite, distant nods on the sidewalk began knocking on the door with casseroles and quiet apologies. A woman 2 streets over admitted to Emma, almost in tears, that she'd repeated a rumor about David at a book club meeting years earlier without ever checking if it was true, and she was sorry, genuinely and specifically sorry, in a way that mattered more to Emma than any of the stranger's comments online ever could. Otis, the co-worker who had first shown David the video in the supply closet, started walking beside him on his rounds every night after that, not out of pity, but because he said he'd rather be remembered as the guy who stood next to David Bennett than the guy who didn't. Even Tyler Grant's mother reached out awkwardly through a mutual acquaintance, offering an apology on behalf of a comment she herself had made years earlier that her son had clearly absorbed and repeated without ever fully understanding where it came from. The school administration, sensing both a public relations opportunity and, to their credit, genuine remorse for 3 years of overlooking what their own students had been enduring, organized an all-school assembly. They asked David if he would be willing to speak. David, a man who had spent 3 years trying to be invisible in the very hallways he cleaned, stood at a podium in front of 600 students, including Tyler Grant, who sat near the back with his phone finally, mercifully, in his pocket. David didn't talk about bridges or blueprints or lawsuits. He talked about his children. He said that for 3 years he thought his job was to protect Emma and Jason from his own shame, and that he had gotten it backward the entire time. His job had always been to show them what it looked like to survive with your dignity intact, no matter what job title the world assigned you. "I mopped these floors so my kids could walk across them with their heads held high," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. And it turns out they were doing the exact same thing for me. The assembly ended not with polite applause, but with the kind of standing, roaring ovation that made Jason, sitting in the front row beside Emma, finally allow himself to cry the tears he'd been holding since that hallway 3 weeks earlier. Tyler Grant approached Jason afterward, red-faced and stammering, and offered an apology that Jason accepted not because it erased anything, but because he understood. Watching his father at that podium, that holding on to anger the way Richard Hale had held onto his lies for 5 years was its own kind of prison, one Jason had no interest in building for himself. Richard Hale's trial concluded 11 months later. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and evidence tampering, sentenced to 7 years, and ordered to pay restitution, a portion of which, through a settlement negotiated by a pro bono attorney who had seen Marisol's reporting, went directly to David in recognition of the reputational and financial damage the false implication had caused. David's engineering license was fully reinstated within 4 months, the suspension formally overturned once the state board reviewed the new evidence. He didn't rush back into a corporate firm. Instead, using a small portion of the settlement and every ounce of credibility Emma's video had unexpectedly returned. To him, David opened a modest structural consulting practice of his own, one that, within its first year, took on pro bono safety reviews for 3 community centers and a local youth shelter, the kind of work that had nothing to do with prestige and everything to do with the man he had always actually been underneath the headlines. Emma never set out to become anyone's inspiration. She still cringes a little when strangers recognize her in grocery stores. Still insists to reporters that she's just someone's daughter. But she has said, in the handful of interviews she agreed to since, that the video was never meant to go viral. It was meant to be true. That distinction matters to her more than any of the numbers ever could. Jason, for his part, has become quietly protective of every kid at Lincoln Heights who gets picked on for things they can't control: a parent's job, a family's income, a last name that carries a story they didn't choose. He started a small lunchtime group at school, informally called the Bennett Table, where any student who's ever felt like the punchline of somebody else's joke is welcome to sit, no explanation required. On the 1-year anniversary of that hallway video, the Bennett family did something quiet, something that never made the news and was never meant to. They drove to the cemetery where Claire was buried, and David knelt at her headstone the way he used to kneel over that broken chair leg. Except this time, there was nothing left to fix. He told her everything: the video, the trial, the assembly, the way their children had rebuilt in a matter of months what had taken years to tear apart. Emma placed a small stone on the headstone, a tradition Claire had once taught her, and said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud, "We didn't let them make him ashamed, Mom. Not for one more day." David's new consulting practice grew slowly but honestly, the way he had always believed things worth having were supposed to grow. He kept a small framed photograph on his desk, not of a bridge or a building, but of Emma sitting on the porch steps the morning she recorded that first video, a still frame Marisol had captured from the footage before Emma even noticed she was being photographed. He told anyone who asked about it that it was the most important structure he had ever been associated with, because unlike steel or concrete, it had been built entirely out of love, and it had held under more pressure than any bridge he'd ever designed. Jason eventually asked his father, one evening over dinner nearly a year after everything had settled, whether he still thought about Richard Hale, whether some part of him still wanted to see the man suffer the way their family had suffered. David considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I used to," he admitted, "but watching you and your sister stand up the way you did, that took up so much space in me that there just wasn't much room left over for hating him. I think that's the real difference between us. He spent 5 years protecting a lie. You two spent 3 years protecting me. Only one of those things was ever going to last." Marisol Vega's reporting eventually won a regional journalism award, though she has said in interviews since that the real credit belongs to a teenager with a phone and a tripod who had the courage to say something true before anyone told her it was allowed. Priya Nair, no longer afraid, returned to the engineering industry under a new company, and she and David remain close friends to this day, often trading emails about small pro bono projects they can take on together. Lincoln Heights Middle School quietly updated its bullying policy that year, though everyone who lived through it agrees that the real change wasn't written into any handbook. It happened in a front hallway, in a school assembly, in a family that refused to let someone else's lie become the last word on who they were. What Emma and Jason understood, long before any adult around them fully caught up to it, is a truth that doesn't need a viral video to be real, though sometimes that's what it takes for the world to finally listen, that shame belongs to the people who do wrong, not the people who are wronged, and that dignity was never something Richard Hale or a cruel hallway video or 3 years of silence had the power to take away from David Bennett in the first place. It had only ever been buried under other people's lies, waiting for 2 kids brave enough to dig it back out into the light, and when they finally did, the world didn't just watch. It listened, it believed them, and for a family that had spent 3 long years being defined by someone else's crime, that was the only kind of viral moment that ever truly mattered. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about families who refuse to be silenced, about children who become the very courage their parents needed, and about the truth, which, no matter how long it takes, almost always finds its way back into the light. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we'll see you in the next one.